Terry Cross is a member of the Seneca Nation and is the founder and executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. His story about the colonization of his people is a fascinating one, and I appreciate the fact he didn't mince words while telling it. His program addresses the ills that came out of all of that and the disruption of that culture. So, bon appetit.
One of my favorite dishes is Iroquois Meal, and sometimes I sell it at auction. So I do dinner parties and make corn soup and fry bread. And corn soup in our tradition is made with our traditional corn. It's much more like what people would understand hominy to be. It's a mixture of the corn and beans, salt pork, and it's quite delectable. And no, I don't share my fry bread recipe.
And we're on.
Well, my name is Terry Cross. My Seneca name is Hanagano. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians. I'm from the Allegheny Reservation. I'm Bear Clan. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association. It's headquartered here in Portland. Well, we're working all over the nation to help tribes solve the problems that affect their children and families. And it really is in response to, the threat of and the imposition of colonialism on indigenous people around the world. So we use the framework of decolonization. For any colonial power to succeed in controlling the indigenous population of the area that they've colonized, they have to take the land, they have to take and control the natural resources, particularly food and water. They have to usurp the governance of the indigenous people, and they have to delegitimize thought. In other words, take away the legitimacy of the language, the worldview, the healing practices, the religion, the education, and basically say that it's less than the colonizers' way of thinking. And finally, in order to be successful, they have to take the children. And because taking away children so disrupts the fabric of the social norms of the society that it begins to break down the very way that people treat one another humanely. Today we're reeling from hundreds of years of children being taken away. So the boarding school era, the federal government established boarding schools where rations were withheld from people if they wouldn't give up their children. In the 1950s, the transracial adoption program was created by the federal government, and hundreds of children removed, and then the government trained the states how to do that, and so thousands of children were removed from their families. No due process, no court hearings, just the government coming in, taking away children. This was called a humanitarian effort, but in fact it was meant to break up American Indian tribes. Today, we still have the worst disproportionality in foster care placement. 17% of the children in Alaska are Native Alaskan, or Alaska Native, and 60% of the children in foster care system up there are Alaska Native. Right here in Multnomah County, it's like the rate, disproportionate rates, over 20 times higher for Native people than non-Native people. We ask people to reject the colonial lie that we are not stupid, we are not incapable of taking our children. Our historic thought and ways of doing things are just fine, and we're reclaiming those all over the nation. So we have a curriculum called Positive Indian Parenting that helps restore the traditional parenting practices. We have a community development model based in something we call the relational worldview, so that we're transforming communities to take charge of their own services and to take care of their own children, bring their children back home if they're lost, to repatriate adults who were adopted out, who were lost to the tribes. So we're really working across the country to undo the damage of colonialism. Most important in that is to restore people's faith in their own culture and their own ways of knowing, and their own indigenous ways of knowing. Positive Indian Parenting is an 8-lesson curriculum. The first lesson is asked people to examine where they learn to parent. And if you learn to parent in boarding school, or if you're learn to parent from people who were raised in boarding school, you didn't get a chance to learn the rich traditions that teach that children are sacred beings, that they're recent from the Creator, and if they're mistreated, the Creator will take them back. The storytelling, the use of cradle boards, the nurturing practices, the lullabies, the teaching of self-discipline, the lessons used around nature and how nature teaches us how to behave. So these are all lessons that it's amazing that this stuff still exists, but it took us 2 years to research it, searching out elders across the United States and into Canada to learn these traditional practices. We've been doing some exciting work in Alaska in the last 5 years. We've been trying to reduce that disproportionality rate, so that the number of Native kids being lost to the state foster care system is reduced, and that children can stay in their own villages. And we now have villages where there hasn't been a foster care placement outside the village in 5 years, where people have stepped up and formed local teams. And when there's it's called an InHome Services system of care. There's not a lot of resources out there in a lot of the villages, but there are people who care. And there's a public safety officer, there's maybe a behavioral health provider, there's a school in many villages. And what you have to do is get all of those people together and have them come into an agreement to act jointly, to have eyes and ears on children, and to be compassionate to families and to be compassionate to children. And so sometimes they're called child protection teams, sometimes they're called wraparound teams, and those teams are going to families even before there's a report to the 1-800 number of the state child maltreatment line, and knocking on the door saying, "We know that there was a problem here last night. Is everybody okay?" And getting into dialogue with the family so that problems can be solved, and being very clear that in this village we have standards as to how children are treated, and we want you to know we're watching. It's important that our communities begin to believe in themselves again. When I go to communities and there are problems with child abuse, neglect, and tribal people have often been told they don't know enough, or they're not good enough or they don't have services enough to serve their children. And my response is, do you really think that's true? What happened 200 years ago? And today, if one of your children was lost out in the woods, what would you do? Would you leave them out there to be exposed to the elements? No, you'd organize a search party. Well, it's no different when the state wants to take your child away to a foster home someplace far away. You have to rally the people. And I've never been to a community where people couldn't talk to me about what it means to have safe children, and then to mobilize around an effort. One of the villages in Alaska that we worked with had a horrendous experience over a decade, where a priest abused a whole generation of boys in the village, and they've been devastated. And through dialogue, through healing, people in that community are starting to emerge and say, no more, we have to stop this. And so, grandmas and aunties and uncles are, mapping out how they're going to change this traumatic past and transform their village into a place where people can feel safe and secure, and the children can be safe and secure.